The soft light of dawn broke over the McCade ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Georgia stood at the kitchen window, watching the land stretch out before her like an endless sea of green and brown. The scent of frying bacon filled the air, mingling with the sharp, earthy smell of the morning dew. She had come to the ranch 3 months ago, sent in place of her beautiful sister, Willow, to help their aunt and uncle after a family tragedy. Georgia had always been the quieter, more unremarkable of the two. Where Willow had bright eyes and a sweet smile, Georgia was, well, plain. It wasn't that she was ugly. Far from it, but she lacked the kind of grace and beauty that turned heads. Here, at the McCade Ranch, she was nothing more than a shadow, a servant who stayed out of the way, made sure the meals were ready, and kept the house in order. Her sister's absence was a constant ache, but she'd pushed that pain down deep. Until, of course, the letters arrived. It had started as something small, something almost unnoticeable. A letter slipped onto the door in the early hours of the morning, written in neat, delicate handwriting. She'd thought it was a mistake at first, perhaps meant for someone else. But the letter was addressed to her, Georgia McCade, in the silence of the morning. Her heart had skipped a beat. Who could possibly know her name, let alone her solitude? The first letter was strange, but harmless, full of riddles and vague words. Yet, there was something about it that gnawed at her, something that made her feel as though she were part of a story she didn't understand. The writer seemed to know little details about her, how she hummed as she worked, the way she always wore the same faded blue dress. Odd, creepy even, and yet, there's a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that this was something special, something just for her. It became a ritual. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, Georgia would stand by the window, watching the horizon for the lone rider who had been delivering the letters. She never saw his face, just the silhouette of a man on horseback heading to the ranch with a sense of purpose. Georgia's heart would race as the rider disappeared into the distance. Every morning, there was a fresh letter. By the time the third letter arrived, Georgia had found herself looking forward to the rider's visits. The letters grew bolder, more personal. The writer spoke of her hands, the way they worked the thread spool as she mended the clothes. There was even mention of her soft humming, a small detail she thought no one could possibly notice. Georgia began to wonder how this mysterious person could know such things. Was it someone from town, watching her without her knowledge? A stranger with a hidden agenda? Or perhaps someone closer than she realized? The questions tangled in her mind, but the answers remained just out of reach. The letters were always left in the same spot, the fence post near the gate. Georgia would go out at dawn when the ranch was still quiet and retrieve them. Each time, her pulse quickened as her fingers brushed the paper, wondering what new revelations awaited her. She kept the letters hidden, tucked under her pillow, a secret she couldn't share with anyone, not even Aunt Millie or Uncle Jed. But everything changed with the fourth letter. It was different, written in the same flowing script, but with an intensity that made George's breath catch. The words were not cryptic or playful like before. They were raw, almost desperate. He watches you the way a drowning man watches shore. He sees you, but cannot speak. Her stomach churned. Was this about Dustin? The silent, brooding man who ran the ranch? He had been distant with her from the start. At first, she had told herself it was simply because she wasn't Willow. It was easy to convince herself that the coldness was due to her own plainness, her lack of charm. But the letter made her feel as though she were being pulled into something deeper. Was a writer talking about Dustin? For days, Georgia found herself drawn to the horizon, looking for the shadow of the lone rider before dawn. She would wait by the window, her heart in her throat, as the sun rose slowly, casting a warm glow over the land. But each morning, the rider remained just out of sight. The mystery of the letters began to consume her thoughts. Who was he? Why was he watching her? Why did he speak of Dustin in such an intimate way? The questions piled up faster than she could process them. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward the writer, toward the words that seemed to understand her in ways she could not explain. Georgia was on the edge now, standing at the precipice of something she didn't fully understand. Hope bloomed in her chest like a fragile flower. She wanted to know the writer's identity, to know the truth behind his words. She knew she couldn't just stand by any longer, waiting for the answers to come to her. It was time for action. And so, as the light of dawn crept over the land, Georgia made a decision. Tomorrow, she would rise early. She would leave the house before the first glimmer of the sun appeared. She would stand by the gate, hidden in the shadows, and wait for the rider. She would finally face the mystery head-on and uncover the secrets that had been quietly unraveling in her life for weeks. For the first time since arriving at McCade Ranch, Georgia felt alive with purpose. The loneliness she had carried with her had begun to shift into something new, something that might just be the beginning of a story she never expected. Her curiosity burned with the intensity of 1,000 questions. And with that, a new chapter began. The next morning, Georgia woke before the birds had begun their songs. The darkness outside still clung to the world, and she felt the familiar weight of her anticipation settle in her chest like a knot. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Aunt Millie, and tiptoed out of the house, her heart thudding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She made her way to the gate, where the early morning mist clung to the ground, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. She hid behind the fence post, her breath held tight as she peered out toward the road. There in the distance was the silhouette of a rider on horseback. It was him, the mysterious letter writer. She could see the shape of the man clearly now, the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the soft dirt, his body a dark figure against the dimming sky. She watched, heart pounding in her chest, as the rider came closer. She should have felt fear, but there was only a magnetic pull, a curiosity that refused to let her turn away. As the rider drew closer, she leaned forward, almost willing herself to see his face. And then, just as he passed, the realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap. The rider wasn't a stranger at all. It was Dustin. She froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. Dustin, the same man who had barely spoken to her since she arrived at the ranch. The man who seemed to look past her, as though she didn't exist, as though she was invisible. But there he was, riding out every morning before the sun rose, delivering letters that spoke of things only someone who watched her closely could know. He knew how she hummed while she worked. He knew the way she threaded the needle, how her hands would tremble ever so slightly when she sewed. Her mind raced, piecing together everything she had felt. The letters, the way they had made her feel seen, understood, valued. And yet, here was the truth. Dustin had been watching her all along, writing letters under the cover of darkness, sharing his thoughts with her in ways he could never speak aloud. She felt a mix of emotions, confusion, betrayal, but also something else, something deeper. It was as if a part of her had known all along that Dustin had been more than just the aloof rancher she saw each day. As she stood frozen by the gate, the realization hit harder than any of the letters ever had. She needed to confront him. She couldn't let this mystery linger any longer, not with the weight of her feelings growing heavier by the day. With a burst of courage, she stepped out from behind the post, calling his name. Dustin reined his horse in sharply, his gaze locking onto hers, his eyes betraying no emotion. "Georgia," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." The words felt like a confession, an apology wrapped in secrecy. She squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "It was you all along, wasn't it? The letters, the writer. You've been watching me, and you've been writing to me like I'm someone special." The accusation hung in the air, but Dustin didn't seem angry, just resigned. He sighed, leaning forward in the saddle. "I didn't know how else to say it," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see you, Georgia. I see you in a way I never thought I could. And I didn't know how to show you that, except through those letters." His words, so raw, so unguarded, made her breath catch. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had expected something different. Anger, maybe, or a defensive excuse. But this was something else entirely. It was a vulnerability that she hadn't known Dustin was capable of. Just as she was about to respond, a loud voice from the direction of town broke their moment. It was Maeve Talcott, the town's self-appointed busybody. Well, Maeve sneered as she walked toward them, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Look at what we have here." The wrong sister finally caught in the act. George's stomach dropped. Maeve had been nothing but cold and judgmental since she arrived at the McCade Ranch. But this was cruelty. "What do you mean?" Georgia asked, her voice small, though she tried to hold her ground. Maeve's eyes gleamed with malice. "You thought you could get away with it? Playing pretend as someone you're not? Everyone knows about you, Georgia, the wrong sister, the one who didn't make the cut. And now we see the truth, just like we always knew." Maeve's words stung like sharp needles. Georgia felt her face flush with embarrassment, her chest tightening with humiliation. She had always been the overlooked one, the one who wasn't pretty enough, the one who was sent to do the chores while Willow got the attention. But hearing it from Maeve, hearing her belittle everything Georgia had ever known about herself, was too much. "Shut your mouth, Maeve," Dustin said sharply, his voice rising for the first time. "You don't know a damn thing about her." But Maeve wasn't finished. "The truth's out now, isn't it?" she crowed. "The wrong sister, chasing after the rancher's heart with your little letters. I'll bet the whole town will have something to say about this." George's world felt like it was collapsing around her. She had always felt out of place, but this public humiliation was something she couldn't bear. She turned to walk away, but then a soft, rustling sound came from the pocket of her apron. The fourth letter, the one she had kept hidden, was now in her hands. How had it ended up there? She didn't know, but it felt like fate. She opened it, and her hands trembled as she read the words. "I know what happened in town today. I saw it all, but I still see you, and I always will." The letter was signed, as always, by the mysterious writer, and yet Georgia knew, without a doubt, who had written it. It was Dustin, the man who had been both the source of her shame and the one who saw her when no one else did. The air was thick with tension the next day as 3 armed riders approached McCade Ranch. Georgia was in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for dinner, when she heard the pounding of hooves growing louder outside. Her heart skipped, and she glanced out the window, spotting the riders galloping toward the ranch. There was something unsettling about the way they rode, rough, wild, like they owned the land they passed through. She knew immediately that they weren't here for anything good. The ranch had been quiet for so long that even the slightest disturbance felt like an intrusion. Dustin stepped into the kitchen just as the riders came to a halt outside, his face darkening with a mix of recognition and concern. "Stay inside, Georgia," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Don't come out unless I say so." She didn't argue, though her curiosity gnawed at her. She had seen that look on his face before, the one that said trouble was coming, but she had never seen him quite so shaken. She wanted to ask him what was going on, but he was already walking toward the door, pulling on his jacket. The riders dismounted and faced Dustin, their eyes cold and calculating. The man at the front, Caleb Marsh, stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Dustin's face. Caleb's presence was enough to make the air crackle with hostility. "Dustin McCade," Caleb sneered. "We've been looking for you." Dustin didn't flinch, but Georgia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his belt as though ready to draw a weapon. Caleb's voice was low, almost mocking. "You think you can walk away from your past, from the debt you owe?" The words hit Georgia like a punch to the stomach. She didn't know what Caleb meant, but she could see the flicker of fear in Dustin's eyes, something he couldn't hide. He hadn't said much about his past, but Georgia knew enough to understand that it hadn't been a good one. Now, it seemed like that past was catching up with him. "I don't owe you anything," Dustin said firmly, but the edge in his voice betrayed the lie. Caleb's grin widened, and he stepped closer, his eyes narrowing in on Dustin. "You're wrong. You owe us $5,000, McCade. $5,000 for the cattle you rustled and sold, and we're here to collect." George's stomach churned as the pieces began to fall into place. Dustin had been an outlaw, a cattle rustler. He hadn't spoken of it, but she had suspected something darker lingered behind his silence. The McCade Ranch, the quiet life he tried to build, it was all part of a story he was trying to outrun. And now, the past had come for him, demanding payment in the form of blood or money. "You've got 2 weeks," Caleb said, his voice cold. 2 weeks to come up with the money, or we'll take it another way." He glanced at Georgia, his eyes flicking over her as though she were nothing more than a pawn in their game. "And we'll start with her if you don't make good." The threat was clear, and it sent a shiver down Georgia's spine. She felt a cold sweat break out across her back, her breath catching in her throat. Dustin's hand twitched at his side, his eyes darkening as he looked at Caleb. "Stay away from her," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low and dangerous. Caleb shrugged, unconcerned. "That's up to you, McCade. You know where to find us." With that, he and his men turned and mounted their horses, riding off with a final, mocking wave. Georgia stood frozen in place, her mind racing. $5,000? Dustin owed that much, and the men weren't going to leave without it. She thought of the ranch, of everything Dustin had worked for, and the fear that gripped her heart twisted. He had a past, a dangerous one. But it wasn't just his life at risk anymore. It was hers too. As the riders disappeared from sight, Dustin stood in the doorway, his back to her. He didn't speak for a long moment, and Georgia could see his jaw clenched tight, his hands fisted at his sides. Finally, he turned to her, his face pale. "I never meant for you to be part of this," he said quietly, his voice thick with regret. Georgia opened her mouth to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she say she understood? How could she tell him that she knew, in some deep part of her, that the man she had come to care for wasn't the one who had ridden with those men, the one who had stolen cattle and lived a life of crime? "It's my mess, Georgia," Dustin continued, his voice rough. "I try to leave it behind. I try to start fresh here. But now they've found me, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." George's heart ached for him. She had spent so much time focusing on the mystery of the letters, on the slow burn of her feelings for him, that she had never considered the darkness that might lie in his past. She could see now that he had been running from it, trying to rebuild a life that was worthy of her. And she had no idea just how dangerous that was. "Is that why you wrote the letters?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you thought you weren't good enough?" Dustin met her eyes, his expression raw. "I didn't think I was good enough for anyone," he confessed, his words spilling out like a secret he had been holding too long. "But you, Georgia, you looked at me like I was something more, like I could be more, and I didn't know how else to show you that." Her chest tightened at the honesty in his words. He wasn't just trying to protect her from the danger outside. He was trying to protect himself from the shame of his past. And in doing so, he had unknowingly pulled her into a dangerous game. Georgia stepped closer, her heart pounding. "You're not that man anymore, Dustin," she said firmly. "I see you. I see the man you are now." Dustin's eyes softened, but before he could speak again, a noise from the porch caught their attention. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, and they weren't alone. A voice called out from the porch, sharp and familiar. "Dustin McCade?" The air seemed to freeze, and George's heart leapt in her throat. It was Willow, the morning after Willow's unexpected arrival. The weight of the previous day's events still hung heavily over Georgia. Dustin hadn't said much after hearing her sister's voice, just a tight nod before walking out to greet her. But George's mind was racing. Willow was beautiful. Everyone in town knew that. She had always been the one to catch every eye, to turn heads, while Georgia had been left in her shadow, unseen and unremarkable. Now it seemed that shadow was back, and the air was thick with the unspoken tension between them. Georgia had never been able to compete with Willow, not in looks, not in charm, and certainly not in the attention that seemed to come so effortlessly to her. As she stood at the window watching Dustin and Willow speak in hushed tones, a growing dread gnawed at her insides. What would Willow think of Dustin? What would she think of George's feelings for him? The letters, the sudden closeness. And what would the town think when the truth inevitably came out? It didn't take long before the inevitable happened. Maeve Talcott, ever the gossip, didn't waste a moment in spreading word of the scandal. It was as if the moment the words left Willow's lips, the entire town knew. And then like wildfire, it caught. Maeve was the first to make her move, showing up at the Mercantile the next day with a gleam in her eye, ready to tear down whatever had been built. "So, we finally know, don't we?" she said, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. Dustin McCade's got himself a secret, a lover in the shadows, no less. The crowd went silent, all eyes turning toward Georgia, who was suddenly at the center of the storm. Her cheeks burned with shame, but it wasn't the kind of shame she had felt before, the kind that came from being overlooked or dismissed. No, this was different. It was the sharp, ugly sting of public humiliation. "I always thought there was something odd about that girl," Maeve continued, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Always hiding away in the background, never quite fitting in." Georgia felt her throat tighten as Maeve's words sliced through her, each one a little deeper than the last. And now it turns out she's been writing love letters to the rancher in the dark, pretending to be something she's not, playing the part of the good sister while she's off courting the real man's attention. It felt like the world had shifted beneath Georgia's feet. The whispers started, too soft to make out at first, but growing louder by the second. Wrong sister. Hiding. Secret lover. Pretender. The words swirled around her, a constant hum in her ears. And through it all, she could hear Dustin's voice, firm and unyielding as he stepped forward to defend her. "Enough, Maeve," he said, his voice cutting through the gossip. "This isn't the time for your cruel games." But Maeve wasn't done. "Well, then, why don't you tell the town what really happened, Dustin? You're the one who wrote those letters, aren't you? You're the one who thought it was so clever to write to her in secret, to fill her head with dreams that don't belong to her. What kind of man does that?" It was a blow, and Georgia could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The rumors were out, the truth was exposed, and now there was no turning back. Dustin didn't flinch, though. He stood tall, meeting the eyes of the people who had gathered, his jaw set. "I wrote the letters," he said loudly, his voice full of raw honesty. "Every word, every sentence. I wrote to Georgia because she mattered to me, even if I didn't know how to say it any other way. I wasn't hiding anything from her. I just didn't know how to be the man she deserved." The crowd fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. There was no going back from his confession, no way to undo the damage Maeve had done with her gossip. But Georgia felt something stir within her, something she had never expected to feel in the face of such humiliation: pride. Dustin had been honest, brutally so, and in that honesty, there was a strength she hadn't seen before. And then, in front of the entire town, Dustin did something even more unexpected. He dropped to one knee. The sound of his boots hitting the dirt echoed in the silence. "Georgia," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I've spent my life running from my past, from who I thought I was. But when I'm with you, I'm not that man anymore. You've made me see that I'm worth more than what I thought of myself. I want to spend every day proving that to you. Will you marry me?" The world seemed to pause, the town square holding its breath as Georgia stood there, frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her heart was pounding in her ears, her thoughts scrambled. This was the man who had written to her, The man who had seen her in ways she never thought anyone could. The letters, the secret gestures, everything had led to this moment. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. The humiliation, the gossip, the tension, it all melted away as she looked into his eyes. In that instant, all she could see was the man who had quietly loved her, who had been there in his own way, even when she had felt invisible. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Tears welled up in her eyes as she bent down to meet him, their lips meeting in a soft, tender kiss. The crowd around them murmured, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Georgia felt like she had finally found a place where she truly belonged, a place where she wasn't just the wrong sister, but the right one for him. The joy was short-lived, however. As they pulled away from each other, a voice broke through the silence. It was Sheriff Clark, his face grave as he approached. "Dustin," he said, his tone serious. "I've got a message for you. Caleb Marsh and his men aren't done. They won't leave without blood or money. You got to be ready." George's heart sank. The joy of their moment was quickly replaced with the harsh reality of the danger that loomed over them. "We don't have much time," Dustin muttered, pulling Georgia close to him. But even as the threat loomed large, a sense of determination filled her. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She was with him, and together, they would face whatever came next. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She had chosen her path, and there was no going back. The days following Dustin's public proposal were filled with a strange mix of excitement and dread. Georgia and Dustin had no time to truly celebrate their engagement. The threat of Caleb Marsh and his men was always looming. They needed $5,000 in 2 weeks to settle the debt Dustin owed, or Caleb would make good on his promise to take it another way. The weight of the money they needed pressed down on George's chest every waking moment. She knew they couldn't raise that amount by selling cattle alone. Time was running out. It was one of those early mornings when Georgia stood in the kitchen, staring out at the sun barely cresting the horizon, that an idea began to form. The ranch might not have the money, but the town, they could help. It wasn't a comfortable thought. She had been humiliated in the town square, a part of her still raw from Maeve's cruel words. And yet, as she thought about the people she had met in the last few months, something inside her stirred. There were people in town who had known loss, people who had fought for what little they had, and she realized that if they were to save the ranch, they would need each other. She turned to Dustin, who was sharpening his knives, his face set in that same stubborn expression that made her admire him so much. "We can't do this alone," she said quietly, her voice hesitant but firm. "We need the town's help." Dustin looked up, his brow furrowing in concern. "You want to go back to them after everything that's happened?" he asked. "After Maeve's gossip?" George's heart clenched at the thought, but she nodded. "We have to. We need the money, and we need to show them that we're not the people they think we are. If we don't ask, we'll lose everything." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes full of conflict, but eventually he sighed. "All right, but we'll go together. I won't let you do this alone." Together, they made their way into town, the tension between them thick as they walked down the dusty main street. When they reached the Mercantile, Georgia hesitated, her hands shaking slightly. The gossip was still fresh, and she could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her as they passed by. But there was no turning back now. They had no choice. Inside, Maeve stood behind the counter, her eyes narrowing when she saw them. "What's this, then?" she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Come to beg for handouts now, have you?" Georgia straightened, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We're not here for charity," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "We need help. We're trying to raise $5,000 to pay off Dustin's debt. Caleb Marsh and his men won't leave without it. And if we don't get the money, they'll take everything. We're asking the town to help." There was a moment of stunned silence. And then, to her surprise, the store owner, Mr. Harper, stepped forward. "I'll give you $500, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. My wife was the wrong choice, too. I know what it's like to be judged for something you didn't choose. Georgia felt her breath catch in her throat. Mr. Harper, of all people, was offering help. Thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. The words didn't seem enough, but they were all she could manage. As they left the store, she felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The rest of the day passed in a blur as they made their way to the blacksmith, the innkeeper, and even some of the gossips who had once whispered behind her back. Slowly but surely, the donations began to add up. The blacksmith, a burly man with a soft heart, gave $300 without hesitation. A few others chipped in smaller amounts, some as little as $10, but it all added up. By the end of the day, they had raised $4,100. It wasn't the full $5,000 they needed, but it was close. George's heart lifted as she thought about what they had accomplished. It was more than just the money. It was the act of coming together, of people setting aside their differences to help each other. They weren't perfect, but they were a community. The final blow came when Georgia realized she still had one possession of value left. Her mother's locket, a small gold piece that had been passed down through generations. She hadn't wanted to sell it, had clung to it for sentimental reasons, but now it seemed like the only way to get the remaining $200 they needed. I'll sell it, she said to Dustin, her voice quiet but firm. We're so close. We can't stop now. Dustin looked at her, his face full of concern, but he didn't argue. He knew how much that locket meant to her. Are you sure? He asked gently. Georgia nodded. We have to do whatever it takes. She took the locket to the pawnbroker in town, her fingers trembling as she handed it over. It was worth more than the $200 he gave her, but in that moment, all that mattered was that they were close to their goal. With the money they had, they were nearly there. But then, as if fate wasn't done testing them, a new letter arrived, the handwriting unmistakable. Dustin opened it, his face paling as he read the words. Sunday at dawn, we're coming. We'll burn that ranch to ash if you don't have the full amount. Don't think we're bluffing. The timeline had been moved up. They were running out of time much faster than they had expected. George's heart dropped into her stomach. They weren't just fighting for money anymore. They were fighting for their lives. She could feel the terror rising in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by something else, determination. They weren't done yet. They couldn't afford to be. Together, they had come this far, and together, they would face whatever came next. Dustin and Georgia spent the next few days preparing for what they knew was coming. The money was as good as raised, but the threat from Caleb Marsh and his gang was not something that could be solved with mere cash. They were determined to take everything Dustin had worked for, and they wouldn't hesitate to use force. Dustin refused to let Georgia leave the ranch. He couldn't bear the thought of her being caught in the crossfire. I want you safe in town, he insisted, his voice rough with a protective urgency. But Georgia, as stubborn as ever, stood her ground. I'm not leaving. This is our fight, Dustin. I'm staying right here with you. There was no arguing with her. So, instead, they spent the days preparing the ranch for the inevitable attack. They checked their supplies, cleaned their rifles, and made sure the house and barn were secure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they would sit together, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on both of them. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was a quiet strength between them now, an unspoken bond forged in the heat of their shared struggle. The night before the showdown, Dustin took George's hand as they sat together on the porch. The sounds of the night, the distant calls of coyotes, the rustling of wind through the trees, seemed far away as they shared the space in the flickering light of the lantern. If something happens, Dustin began, his voice low, heavy with emotion. But Georgia cut him off, squeezing his hand. Nothing will, she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. We're not done yet. We've made it this far, and we'll make it through tomorrow too. Her words were meant to reassure him, but in truth, She wasn't sure. Fear had settled deep in her bones, but so had something else, determination. They couldn't let Caleb win. Not now, not after everything they had fought for. As the hours passed and the night deepened, they took turns sleeping, the ever-present fear of the next day gnawing at them both. When dawn finally arrived, Georgia was already awake, standing at the window, staring out at the horizon. It was still dark enough to feel like the world hadn't fully woken yet, but she could already hear the sound of hooves in the distance. She knew what was coming. Caleb and his men were on their way. Dustin joined her at the window, his face grim. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of what they were about to face. They didn't have long before the riders would arrive, and George's heart was pounding in her chest. She could feel the tension building between them, the quiet before the storm. They had no more time for planning. The only thing left was to stand their ground. As the first light of day broke over the land, Caleb and his gang appeared on the horizon. George's pulse quickened as she watched them approach, the 6 riders cutting a sharp line against the early morning sky. Caleb, at the front, was a tall man with a face that could have been carved from stone. His eyes were cold, calculating. The others were no less menacing. George's stomach twisted with fear, but she forced herself to stay calm. She was not going to back down. They weren't going to lose their home. Not today. Dustin stepped forward, standing tall in front of Georgia, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. "I've got your money," he called out, his voice carrying over the distance. The riders halted at the edge of the ranch, their eyes flicking over Dustin and then to Georgia, standing behind him. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the couple, and a grin spread slowly across his face. "You think this is going to be enough?" he shouted back, his voice full of derision. Dustin's jaw clenched, but he didn't falter. "It's everything I have," he said firmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the money, holding it up. $4, 300. "That's all I've got." Caleb's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "$4, 300? He scoffed. "That's an insult. You think we're going to let you off the hook for that? We made a deal, McCade. You don't pay up, and we take what's ours." As he spoke, one of the men dismounted, walking toward the barn with a torch in his hand. The sight of it sent a chill through George's spine. They were going to burn the ranch down if they didn't get the full amount. She felt her pulse spike as she instinctively reached for the rifle Dustin had left against the wall. She wasn't going to let them destroy everything they had fought for. Taking a deep breath, Georgia stepped forward, aiming the rifle steady in her hands. "You won't leave alive if you set that fire," she called out, her voice clear and unwavering. Caleb paused, raising an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly as he noticed the rifle aimed at his man. The rider with the torch stopped in his tracks, his gaze flicking between Georgia and Caleb. "You're not in charge here, woman," Caleb sneered, but the mockery in his voice didn't hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Georgia didn't flinch. She knew what she had to do. "Next shot goes through your knee," she warned, her voice colder now, more certain. Caleb's eyes narrowed in a mixture of disbelief and fury, but before he could respond, a distant shout reached their ears. "Hold your fire." The voice was unmistakable. It was Sheriff Clark, accompanied by a handful of deputies, and behind them, a growing number of townsfolk. George's heart surged with relief. The crowd had come, and they weren't about to let Caleb have his way. The standoff held for a tense moment, until Sheriff Clark's voice rang out again. "Caleb, you've got no business here. We're taking you in." The gang looked around, realizing they were outnumbered and outgunned. Caleb glared at Dustin, his men, and the growing crowd, his face contorted in rage. With one last defiant glare, he spat on the ground and motioned for his gang to retreat. "This isn't over, McCade," he growled. "We'll be back." As the riders retreated, Dustin turned to Georgia, his eyes soft with gratitude and something deeper. They had won for now. Georgia dropped her rifle, her hands trembling as relief washed over her. And as they embraced, a voice rang out from the porch. Dustin McCade? It was Willow. Willow's voice broke through the tension in the air, and for a moment, Georgia felt as though time had stopped. She turned toward the porch, her heart pounding, her thoughts racing. She hadn't expected her sister to appear at the ranch today, not with everything that had happened. But there she was, standing tall and beautiful, her golden hair catching the light of the early morning sun. For a brief moment, everything else seemed to fade into the background as Georgia stared at her sister, the woman who had always been the center of attention, the one who had always overshadowed her. But this time, it wasn't just Willow's beauty that stood out. It was the quiet, vulnerable expression on her face that caught George's attention. Willow was no longer the carefree, self-assured woman she remembered. There was something different in her eyes now, something that made George's heart ache with empathy. She stepped forward, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say to Willow after all that had passed between them, after the years of being the wrong sister, after the scandal, the gossip, and the betrayal. She had never been the one who was chosen, never the one who was seen. But now, in this moment, standing on the porch of McCade Ranch with Dustin's arms around her, Georgia knew something had changed. "Georgia," Willow said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry." Georgia's breath caught in her throat, her emotions swirling. "Sorry for what?" she asked, her voice low. "For everything," Willow replied, her voice thick with regret. "For not being there for you. For always being the one who got the attention. For making you feel like you weren't enough." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken tension. Georgia swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She had spent so many years in Willow's shadow, convinced that she was somehow less than her beautiful sister, that she didn't deserve love or attention. But as she looked at Willow now, at the woman who had once seemed so perfect and untouchable, she realized that Willow had been struggling too. She had her own battles, her own fears, her own insecurities. "I never wanted to hurt you," Willow continued, her voice quiet and sincere. "I always thought you'd be fine. I thought you'd be okay because you were the strong one. But I was wrong. You were always the one who deserved more." George's heart broke at her sister's words. She had never heard Willow speak like this before. It was as if the walls between them were finally coming down, brick by brick. "You were always the stronger one, Georgia," Willow said with a sad smile. "I just had better hair." A quiet laugh escaped George's lips despite the tension in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the years of rivalry between them had melted away. She stepped forward and embraced Willow, holding her tightly as the years of silence and unspoken pain seemed to fade into the past. "We'll figure this out," Georgia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Together, Willow pulled back slightly, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "I hope you know how proud I am of you," she said. "You've always been stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I can see that now." The words felt like a balm on the wounds that had festered for so long. They weren't perfect, and their relationship wasn't magically healed, but this moment felt like a start, a new beginning. Just then, Willow reached in her bag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to Georgia, her eyes soft with sincerity. "This is for you," she said quietly. "I don't have much, but I want to help. I want to make things right." Georgia took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a wad of cash, exactly $700. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what this meant. It was the final amount they needed to pay off Caleb's debt. Willow had given everything she could to help them, even after everything that had passed between them. She had given her sister the gift of a fresh start. "Willow," Georgia said, her voice thick with emotion, "you don't have to do this. We've raised enough, But Willow shook her head, a soft smile on her face. "Yes, I do. I can't undo the past, Georgia, but I can help you start a new future. One where you're seen, one where you're loved. I want to be part of that." Georgia swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her sister's words in a way she hadn't before. For so long, she had craved Willow's approval, but in this moment, she realized that the approval she needed most was her own. She didn't need to be perfect or to live in Willow's shadow anymore. She had Dustin. She had the town's support. And now, she had her sister's blessing. It was more than she had ever dreamed of. With the $700 in hand, Georgia and Dustin set to work, preparing for their wedding. The ceremony was simple, nothing extravagant, just the two of them, standing under the cottonwood tree, surrounded by friends and family who had come to support them. The air was warm, the sky clear, and the soft sound of horses grazing nearby was the perfect backdrop to their vows. "I choose you," Dustin said, his voice strong and steady. "Not because I think you'll fix my past, but because you make me want to be a better man. Because in your eyes, I see a future I didn't think I deserved. I love you, Georgia, more than I ever thought I could love anyone." Tears welled in Georgia's eyes as she looked at him, her heart full. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Because with you, I am seen. Because you love me for who I am, not for who I was. Because you make me feel like I matter every single day." They kissed softly, tenderly, in front of everyone who had supported them. And in that moment, it felt like the whole world had finally fallen into place. That night, as they lay together in bed, Dustin handed Georgia one last letter. It was simple, a quiet declaration of everything they had been through. Being seen isn't being exposed. It's being known and still chosen. Georgia smiled as she held the letter close, knowing that the future ahead of them will be full of more love, more letters, and more shared moments than she could ever have imagined. 1 year later, Georgia was pregnant, and Dustin was riding in from the fields as the morning sun broke across the horizon. She stood at the porch, waiting for him, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the love that had blossomed in her heart. When he dismounted and kissed her, he handed her another letter. It was about their daughter, about how she would know love was loud and brave. As they stood there together, watching the sunrise, Georgia realized that the bravest thing she had ever done wasn't just surviving Dustin's past. It was choosing their future out loud for everyone to see. She no longer had to hide in the shadows. Together, they had written their own story, one that would be told without shame or fear, one that would live on in their hearts forever.